So perhaps we'll start. I still have students left. Not many, at least 3 ones. The topic of today is the sad story of the fall of Chinese civilization. It took a long time, and in this first section we'll deal with the 17th and 18th centuries in Japan and what people were doing here. The idea is Japanese competition against Chinese cosmological centrality. And they were doing this by taking conceptions from Buddhist and Western geographic conceptions, because they were expressing a different kind of world than the Chinese conceptions did. So this is the rule. At first everything is quite silent, not too many things are taking place. But Japanese are simply writing a number of books. I've used here 2 scholars as help in these lectures. One is Matsuda Koichiro, who published in 1998 an interesting article, Asia no Tasho sei Asia Shugi Izen Asia. He's looking at the situation from Japanese point of view, how the Japanese did not like, well, in one sense they liked, in the other sense they did not like being within the Chinese cultural sphere. And the other one is D.L. Howland's Borders of Chinese Civilization, Geography and History at Empire's End. And he is here taking a look from the Chinese point of view. Chinese civilization is Howland's concept. With it he means not only the same characters, like now people can talk about kanji bunkaken, the sphere of Chinese characters. When Chinese civilization went deeper, it meant same kind of education in Chinese classics, which meant that people were able to understand each other quite deeply, if not with spoken language, then with written language. They had same kind of understanding of the world, same concepts, same literature, same culture. And this is a sphere that included China and Japan, Korea and Vietnam, basically. The earliest mention that I have seen about this issue is here in Asami Keisai's text about China, Chinoku Ben. The problem is that in Tokugawa period, Japanese imported lots of Chinese culture and created an administrative system which was basically based on Confucian system of organization. Of course, Buddhism also remained here in Japan quite strongly, but the central administrative system was like this. The problem is that always when the Japanese were reading Chinese books, they were placed in the position of barbarians, because they were not true Chinese. Jushomi gaidokoi teki to isama, aruta arayuru bangoku mina teki to omohi hanahara ayamarinari. When reading Confucian books, usually that foreign countries are called barbarians. To think of foreign countries as barbarians is a terrible mistake. It is this situation that made Japanese interested in any non-Chinese conceptions of the world. And European conceptions was one thing. Well, this is here in a graph the situation. In the center we have China, where we have Bumme civilization. Then we have Toi, Namban, Seiju, Hokoteki, the normal list. And I showed you this graph before, that always when we are importing things, concepts, ideas, words, names, and so on, from one culture to another, the idea becomes quite different. Because it has to be interpreted to fit the local place. And what happens to the concept of Asia is that it comes when this discussion, it's not anti-Chinese, but something else than Chinese discussion, is that Asia comes to Japanese language, and you start to find it in Japanese literature from the early 17th century onwards, even late 16th. But it is placed in a situation where we already have other concepts. One is Bankaku, which means, well, literally 10,000 countries, but in a sense, a myriad countries, many countries. And the other one is Toyo, the Eastern Ocean. Both of these also come from China. But Bankaku is a Buddhist concept. It was used by Chinese Buddhists to create a world which is composed of many countries and not one central country surrounded by peripheries. A multitude of countries where no country is in high position. Chinese Buddhists used it for spreading their own religion, which was India-centered, and to make people, the Chinese people at that time, more receptive to non-Chinese ideas. And Toyo is a new interpretation of, well, Chinese geography, which we'll go into later. Asia also came, but did not come into an important position at this time. When we think of the geopolitical strategies of pride in the center-periphery structure, we understand that all national actors are proud. They are proud of themselves. And here in the center, we have supremacist cosmology, which means people in the center think that they are at the top of the world. They are best in the world. Here in the peripheral countries, you are also proud, but you have basically two different strategies. You can learn the center's culture and civilization as well as you can, and make yourself better than the center. You can compete along the center's cosmology. And it is said that Korea is in this position, that they became even better Confucianists than the Chinese did. Or the other strategy is to compete with the center by adopting a different cosmology. And this is what the Japanese did. Nowadays, the situation is again quite different. Chinese are nowadays, and Koreans, they are quite eagerly learning foreign languages. And then there are places who have been in a supreme position before, like Japan, which used to be in the 1970s, 1980s, still in the early 1990s, the most unbeatable country in the world. I remember when I came here first time in Japan in the 1980s, about 25 years ago. People from under the bridges, people who drink and don't have a place to live, come from down under the bridge in front of me and saying, "We Japanese are good, and you Euro-Americans are nothing." Japanese were very proud. Nowadays they are not so proud anymore, but they are somehow closing in on themselves. I've been visiting also Korean and Chinese universities, and I think Koreans and Chinese learn foreign languages now more eagerly than Japanese do. Which we perhaps can see also in this classroom, because we don't have many students in a class that is given in English. And the bad foreign language abilities of Japanese are becoming famous actually in the world also. And a few years ago, it turned out that Japanese students going out to study abroad is going down, while Chinese and Koreans are rising. But I can't say that Europeans are much better. In a small country, citizens of small countries like me, we learn languages. But if you go to bigger countries like Britain or France, Spain, Italy, they are not very interested in the foreign places. And Europe is in some sense much in the same situation as China used to be in the 19th century. Quite closing in on itself, its own problems. And Europe is big. It is an interesting place. But it's not so many people who have the interest to look very keenly outside. And USA is in a quite similar position. They don't learn too much foreign languages. And USA is also big. So these tend to change, but now we are in a situation where China was at the top, and there was a competitor here. Some 400 years ago. Perhaps the reason why Korea wasn't able to compete so much is that it's so close to China. And China was always militarily much more, well, it simply was dominating in Korea all the time. But when we have countries like Japan, Vietnam, Tibet or Mongolia, they held quite fast to Buddhist religion and did not so much adopt Chinese culture to a certain extent, but they were importing only in a selective manner. But basically, this area is what composes Chinese civilization, especially Vietnam, Japan, Korea, and China itself. Another reason, not only the fact that Japan was separated by sea from China, also the fact that Japan had this European history. The Nanban period from 1543 to 1639, when lots of Portuguese came here. Even nowadays you can see the influence in Japanese language. We have tempura, botan, kappa, quite many words from Portuguese. And there were also world maps based on Portuguese world maps called Nambanzu. Maps show southern barbarians. And even though Japan was, so to say, closed after 1639, there actually was lots of publication of these books still, these maps still. The publication little keys. They were actually printed as ukiyo-e, both these Nambanzu and Matteo Ricci's maps that came from China. And the prints could run as big as tens of thousands of copies. And then we had about 500,000 Christians in Japan at the beginning of the 16th century. No, must be 17th century. and perhaps even 100,000 Christians later. They were hiding, they were not open, but because they existed, the Bakufu, the Japanese government, had to publish propaganda against Christians, which again meant that the Japanese always, or at least many Japanese, always had a kind of image of the existence of an outer world. I don't have any of these maps that I could show you legally because these go into the internet. But Kobe City Museum has nice collections in the internet of this kind of maps, and also other maps. And you can go later by yourself and take a look if you want. Yeah. Especially demand for this world map started in 1645, after Japan had been closed. And there were also many separate studies in Japan. We have Kangaku, when you study Chinese matters. Then so-called Rangaku, Dutch studies later. And also something called Yogaku, which I think it is better term than Rangaku, because the people who came to Deshima in Nagasaki, they were not only Dutch, but many European nationalities who simply said that we are Dutch. We had the Swedes and British and Germans and so on. Kangaku and Yongaku were not necessarily opposite to each other. Often same people did both. They simply became scholars and must sing both kind of knowledge. But this is also going around all the time in Japan. Koreans were intelligent people. They also, the Korean government, kept a close eye on what is taking place in the outside world. They practically sent embassies to China every year. And these embassies bought also Western books in addition to Chinese books. And they were also perused in Korea. But the difference between Korea and Japan here is that in Korea, these books went only into government special uses. They were used as intelligence. But in Japan, the spread of Western ideas was wider. And not only in the government level, but also in the scholarly level. So perhaps all these differences explain why Japanese were the ones who were kind of earliest in what we nowadays call East Asia, to take these Western concepts. Asami Keisai, he lived in Nagasaki and met the Dutch and other nationalities. And he published in Kyoto in 1695 a book, Kaitsu Shoko, which is an interesting book. First, if you read the text, it is almost completely, well, it is nearly completely following Chinese understanding of the world. So he divided the countries of the world into three groups. First we have what he called Chukua, meaning China in his reading. Then you have foreign countries. And the countries that were elevated at the level of states were Japan, Ryukyu, Korea, Annam and Champa. Annam and Champa are what we nowadays call Vietnam. At that time it was divided into two different states. Champa in the south and Annam in the north. And the rest, Gai, foreign, outer, barbarians. Siam, Luzon, nowadays Philippines, India, Holland and others, which were not using Chinese characters. So he's taken a Chinese cosmology, but still placing these, which are with these countries within the Chinese cultural sphere, in the civilization, and these in the barbarity. So this was one strategy. But he also had a very rough, drawn map in this book. And one can see clearly that he had access to at least Matteo Ricci's world maps, because we have this, Megalanica, this big continent here, this musical continent. Mekka, Rahnika is even written here. Here we have Japan. And here we have, to my knowledge, for the first time in Japanese written history, the name Asia written. This is the first publication. So here the name appears. Asaya Shokoku, he called that continent. Another thing that is different is that here we don't have China in any kind of noble characters. We have Toda, this is the Tang dynasty and their land, so it is Tang land. So no noble name was in this case placed into China. Also in the text of the book it is called like this, but not here in the map. So we are in a situation where he clearly had a Chinese Confucian education, and the red text was from this. And here we have a new knowledge that he had acquired from various sources. Then here we have Tenchiku, meaning Buddhist India, in the center of the continent. So basically, Asia appeared beside the Buddhist conception here. So it appeared, but together with other concepts. And the Chinese place was here placed downwards. Oh, here it's only a little bit smaller. We also had musical lands, women's country here, country of small people here, and so on, which you could place, of course, in the periphery. When we go to his other books, published 25 years later, Nihon Suidoko, then you have also these European names written in his text. Not in a very important position. You have lists of names. Daichi Kaiwa, Chutai Sekidoni, Kitani Arite, Sanshutanas, Iwaku Asaya, Iwaku Europa, Iwaku Rimi. The first one is situated to the north of the belt of the equator and is named 3 continents. They are called Asia, Europe, and Libya. You can see from the way it is pronounced that he probably heard this from the Dutch. Because it is not a Chinese reading of these characters. But this is not a very important place. Asia basically appeared within this kind of lists in the literature at that time. But it was there. Let's go back still yet. He was also one of these authors who at this time already systematically used China only the name Tangland and not the central country name. Another one is Arai Hakuseki, who's even more important. Hakuseki was a self-taught Japanese Confucian scholar who had been reading books of Confucius and Mencius and these others. And he became the advisor to the 7th shogun, Ieyasu, at the early 18th century. And right after he had become into this position, he was sent to interrogate a person called Giovanni Battista Sidotti, who was an Italian priest, Jesuit, who was sent by Rome to Japan to find out what had happened to the Japanese Christians in more than 150 years. Because there were rumors in Rome that there could be about 1 million Christians in Japan. And Rome had to try to get control of them. Well, Sidotti came to Japan, landed on the coast, and he was caught almost immediately and taken under custody. And so Hakuseki went to interview and interrogate him. A few years later, these very long discussions led to the publication of the book Seiyo Kibun, Records of the Western Ocean, or not publication, writing of this book. It was not published in printed form until 1882, but it spread in Japan as handwritten copies, so it was not completely forgotten, and was quite influential in its own time. He was not only an author, he was also the advisor. Basically, he was what we could nowadays call a kind of prime minister, because he had to take the practical administration of the country into his hands. Shogun at this time used to spend his time in the harem and having fun and so on most of the time, and other people did the actual work. One problem is the relation of Japan to the neighboring countries, especially China and Korea, especially to Korea. And one big problem was the name of the Japanese leader. Now, we had an emperor in China written with this kind of characters. And for a long time, the Japanese also had called their nominal ruler an emperor, also using different characters. But at this time, he was here in Kyoto and away from actual politics and handling of the matters of the country. Instead, we had in Edo, a so-called Seitai shogun, barbarian, subjugating, great military commander. This title was sensible in Japan. It placed him nominally under the emperor, and in practice as the practical ruler of the country. But this title was not usable abroad. Koreans or the Chinese did not recognize this kind of title. Because what you should have in countries neighboring China was a king. The Koreans had a king, Vietnamese had a king, and so on. And Japanese did not. The first shoguns simply, when we had diplomatic intercourse and you had to write letters to the ruler of the other country, the first people simply signed the letters with their own name. Minamoto no Ieyasu, Nihon no Hidetada. But again, the diplomatic problem is that these are not titles of king. Japan, of course, but it is called that it was the period of closed Japan, Sakoku Jidai. Japan was not closed. Simply Japanese were prohibited to going outside and coming in. And the Portuguese were prohibited against coming to Japan. But there was lots of trade with China, also with Korea. The Dutch also came. And some trade also in the north with the Ainu, and through them also to the continent. And Koreans came Japan also every few years with an official embassy. They were keen on understanding what is taking place in neighboring countries, so they also sent embassies to Japan. In 1911, 2 years after Hakuseki became the advisor, there also was a Korean embassy. Well, Hakuseki, his policy is that because we are within the Chinese civilization, in Japan there should be a king. In addition to the emperor in Kyoto who was not taking part in politics. Because only kings can follow proper diplomatic relations with neighboring countries, especially the Koreans here. And so in diplomatic papers written in Hakuseki's time, the shogun is called Japanese king. Not afterwards, and only in this time, only in this year. Other Japanese didn't approve of this. And also the Koreans were not too impressed. When they came back home and wrote a report of their visit, they used this title for the shogun, Washu, chief time of the dwarf slaves. So this was a failure. But the whole mental pain that Hakuseki had during this embassy made him interested in what Shidotti had been talking to him 2 years earlier. And this situation then resulted in the Seiyo Kibun, that manuscript. Because this created big problems. Trying to be Japanese, follow Japanese rules, and be within the Chinese cultural sphere. Another problem, Chinese economy was booming. China was the industrial leader of the world, selling industrial goods, well-manufactured goods to the rest of the world, and importing all silver that was possible. The silver was minted into coins, spread into the economy, and had the economy going on. And Chinese were buying all silver they could also from Japan, which meant that silver became scarce in Japan, its price rose, led to inflation, and the samurai class, where Hakuseki also was a part, fell into poverty because they were in the rice economy. And what Hakuseki did is that he adopted a Chinese policy. In 1715, he created a permission system for foreign ships, that the ship who had been to Japan was allowed to come again, only if the ship captain had a letter written on Japanese paper, allowing the ship to come again. This was a way to, little by little, decrease the number of Chinese ships. But it is also a way to do what the Chinese were doing. And a way of creating Japan as a new kind of center in competition with China. And Seijo Kibun belongs to this kind of policy also. It's a treatise of an alternative world organization. And Hakuseki is using a lot these geographic names. He notices this term, the Chinese call it Yaxia, or how he himself read it as Yasuya. He did not like the name. I don't know why. Perhaps Yasuya also sounds like Yasui, too cheap, I don't know. So what he heard from Sidotti's mouth is Asia, Italian pronunciation of Asia. And that's what he started to use. And not characters, because they also seem back to him, but this katakana form. He also heard Oluoba and read them in contemporary Japanese Yoroha. But he heard from Sidotti Europa, and that's what he started to use. Also, Africa and America are the way that Sidotti pronounced them. So at that time they came to Japanese language. I don't know why Europe was later changed in Japanese into the Europa as it is nowadays. Which probably is from English language, but the others have not been changed. They are from Siddhartha. Other concepts, and these were more important to Hakuseki than Asia or Europe. Asia and Europe remained with him only geographic terms, and never as ethnonyms. Concepts like Asia-Jin, Asian Persian, never appeared in his text. But he used something else, concepts taken from the Chinese cosmology. We have here Taiseiyo, Great Western Ocean, Taiseiyo no Hito, person from the Great Western Ocean, Seiyo-Jin, person from the Western Ocean, or Seijin, Western people. This is what he called Europeans. And in Seijo Kibun, we have corresponding words, Todo, eastern soil, Todo no Hito, we brought to eastern soil. When we did not yet have this ocean terminology referring to these. But in a book written in 1725, when he was retired also, had more time to think of these, then he started to use Toyo, Eastern Ocean. And he also used the concept of Tozai Taiyo, Eastern and Western Great Oceans. This means that he depicted in the East one cultural area, which was not only Japan, but it included also China, the whole area here. In the West, we had this Atlantic area with Western people. You had two cultural centers, and China is placed into one center, but not as the most important one. What does ocean mean? In European languages, it means a large expanse of salty water. That is an ocean. The Chinese concept is much more cultural. We have geography. But it became used, especially in southern China, in connection with the foreigners who came with their ships from abroad to trade with the Chinese. And because of this situation, it also had the meaning of people and culture, their own strange ways. and also this trade convention. So it contains both land and sea and the people. So it's much more usable as a geographic and geopolitical concept than the ocean as such. Hakuseki mentioned in both books in passing the Chinese way of writing their own country. Can be the central country, can be like Qing, the Qing dynasty and so on. But he preferred practically always to write China in this way. China also comes from Buddhist texts used by Buddhists in China, also as a way of putting down Chinese centrality. And China in katakana is what he heard from Sidotti's mouth. Sidotti, of course, knew no Chinese, no Japanese, no language skills. So he was poorly European. And he can write, Waga kuni hitori higashi ni aru no minarasu. China wa mata higashi ni arita. So Japan is not only in the east. Toyo is composed of all of this large area. And China is not in the center. This is the basic message. Bangoku no naka, sono dojo hiroku oki naru wa, Tarutaria to Toruko ni shikumara nashi. Among the myriad countries, and Bangkok is also important. There are many big countries, and the biggest ones are Tartary, being the northern areas ruled by Mongols, and Turkey, which also was a big country. This is also Sidotti's knowledge. He knew that these two entities were very, very big. Of course, China is also big, but Sidotti did not consider it as big. So China is an ordinary country, one of the myriad countries in the world, and nothing else. So we have a world without a center, or a world with multiple centers. And this is a situation where these Western concepts were imported here.